Hey, what's up, everybody? I just wanted to please ask everybody sign up to my Patreon, patreon.com, MikeGrib8, just like my Twitter at. It really helps support the podcast, and yeah, I'm really need the help from you guys. I really appreciate everybody who has signed up so far. So thank you so much. So we can keep doing this work on improving scouting and just learning and spreading knowledge about basketball scouting. Really appreciate all the listeners, and if you can't, it's understandable. But if you could, please help me out on Patreon, patreon.com at MikeGrib8. Thank you so much.
I was watching the episode with us and Evan, and I just wanted to clear it up because like I think I didn't explain it so well. Like the part you were talking about, like you were asking about how something like Chris Beard's impact or John Calipari's impact, how that could affect, like how does that first of all go into the value projection chart that like, we kind of been using a little bit. And
Yeah.
I think like a good like response to that, maybe I hope it kind of answers your question, is like value is basically like the player right now. Like if tomorrow they played in the NBA, what would they be? So
Mhm.
I think that's why like I gave the answer that like something like Beard's impact or Calipari's impact will be in value, because that's like right now it's impacting them. And like if you want to see how they be tomorrow in the NBA, you would like, and then projection is everything else that they like that helps us project them into whatever we just have 5 years or 3 years from now, if that makes sense, like all the aspects that would make
Yeah,
them a
yeah, yeah.
different player in years down the line, when in their prime usually. um so yeah, I hope that kind of answers better your question, that part. There's another one too, but yeah, does that make sense? Do you have
Yeah,
any
no, that
follow-ups?
makes yeah. No, that makes sense more. Yeah.
And then the other thing is what's it called, you talked about, I think, with like sometimes like there's different coaches, like you said basically like somebody might be like impacting their team the same way like a Calipari or like a Chris Beard is, but we just don't know because there isn't enough prospects from that team. We haven't had as much history, so
Yeah.
we can't really tell. And that's a legitimate point. I think I agree with you also, but I think Evan gave a decent response for that, as far as you could look at players at different contexts, and you should be looking at players at multiple different contexts, like how they play in a high school AAU, or if they play FIBA, or they play international and so forth. And yeah, just but besides that, I think it's a legitimate point that yeah, like some things we just can't always, like we're never
Yeah.
going to be able to always.
Yeah. I think it would be kind of difficult to like look at different contests because like it's already difficult to project from like high school to college because obviously like everyone's like Reg was saying, like, everyone's like the guy on their team. So you would have to look more at like I think FIBA or like maybe AAU teams where maybe there's like another higher usage guy on their team. But it's like kind of hard to project like different contexts, specifically since like you're already going from a high, like you're going from like a higher usage to probably a lower usage in college, and then you have to not only remediate that with like the player themselves, but like also how they're going to project from that role to the NBA. So there's like a lot of like moving factors and variables there.
Yeah, high school isn't a great context to project from. You're right, but
Yeah,
AU is very. In fact, like sometimes I almost feel like AU is like almost like 50% of my eval, like compared to
yeah,
college. Like it's like very been effective. Like guys that did better in AU are very often outplay. Like Jason Tatum was excellent in AU. What's his name? Who was it just thinking of? Like Cole Anthony kind of had a poor college season and like looked better in AU. I mean, probably he hasn't played up to that level in NBA, but still, like there's a lot of examples of guys that kind of PJ Washington is another one. Then that kind of shows you like the Kentucky guys in particular. I think you should, especially for them, like take their AU stuff into account a lot more. But for high school, I think it's tougher. Like in the Regis era, like everybody kind of played for their hometown schools more so. I mean, there was still like Oak Hill and stuff, but like
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
now it's getting a lot more consolidated for like the big star names. So I think from that perspective, I think it's getting a little bit easier to evaluate high school.
Well, but he made a
yeah, yeah,
decent point that when you go down, like that's kind of the reason people do tiers, especially again as you move down the draft. Like guys are really close together there, and like when you go within the same tier, then you could start more making the argument for fit over best player available because you have guys kind of
yeah, yeah, exactly.
within the same tier. It's so close out down there. Do that kind of like I kind of knew that, but like I kind of didn't, for some reason I didn't really think of that when we talked about it before. So yeah, did you have any thoughts on that? Like,
Yeah, like that's just the whole episode of Evan. I think like we're all very similar like frames of thought. So like when he says something that isn't relatively like immediately obvious, we start thinking, oh wait, what? Like the thing about the tiers, I never like that was news to me too. I never thought like there could be an approach either like tiers, BPA, or like a mix of both, like the integration of BPA and tiers, like especially when you go down like the lower ranks of the draft. Like, that just wasn't, it wasn't my cognizant thought. So I think that was, it was really good just to have Evan on overall, just to provide like very slight tweaks to what we think of, but like those slight tweaks are actually like pretty monumental in the way we approach and draft about. Mitch specifically, he really like provided the eye test in a very methodical way, which is a little like a deviation from what I've seen other places. But he really like he truly did provide a framework and how he like goes through every single player, like the specific things he like looks for. And he does have like on his pin tweets, like he has another like very methodically laid out like sheet and how he evaluates every single play or like every single instance that's occurring on the court. So I think just overall, Mitch is very, very detail oriented. He goes to like very every single little like minutia. And as he was
yeah,
talking, he was just mentioning little stuff that I didn't even like think of. And so overall, just his very detailed approach to the eye test is, I thought just the structure he provided is very helpful, and I think it's pretty applicable for anyone, except for shooting development. So I think we should have like more guests and talk about like shooting development, really get the minutiae of that concept.
yeah. It's just it's well, we could kind of plot it out in another time, but it's hard to think of
Exactly. Yeah.
people that have really like interesting ideas about that. Because I mean, we could talk about like somebody who knows shot mechanics really well and stuff like that, and we probably should, but I don't know if they'll have like some insight that we don't already have into like exactly how to develop. Because one thing that I heard that's real interesting to me, at least, about that is like kind of along the lines of what John said is that almost anybody pretty much, at least among like high major type, like Division 1 type of athletes, could reach that, like pretty high level of shooting, but it's just a matter of them getting older and then being able to stick in the league long enough basically to get to that part, to get to that being that good. Because if you look at it, like if you look at players that have a certain number of attempts, like say, I don't know, 5 attempts per 70 possession, or like even maybe 3 attempts per 70 possession, or so, something like that, like at least some uh decent number, now like super low sample size. There's almost nobody, like what's the lowest 3-point percentage in NBA history among qualifiers? Maybe there's like single seasons where guys shoot in like low 20s,
Yeah.
or like when the 3-pointer first became implemented and guys were still figuring out. There's like examples of that, but like in the last like decade plus, it's very rare you see guys that actually take 3-pointers and shoot maybe below 30% or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's also a little bit like survival bias or survivorship bias, right? Like if
Yeah,
they were
maybe.
like that horrendous, they wouldn't even be there in the first place. So
Yeah, maybe, but you would think there would be at least some examples, but it's like almost again like maybe even never happens. But yeah, it's worth doing some maybe more
yeah,
research on
that's
how that
true.
works. Yeah, because it's not like in Europe there's a ton of guys shooting 20% or something. I mean, obviously the competition is easier from that perspective, but
Yeah.
like still, yeah,
Yeah, maybe like someone who's actually seen like the what I've been my approach to this issue is like I focus specifically on people who like outlierly develop shooting. So I'm not really focusing on people who like stagnate around like 30%, even if they start at 15 or something. But like if you can like really look at like the highest echelon of players who are like experiencing massive jumps and like pinpoint like parts of their characteristics as a player and see what specifically is a commonality that leads to that outlier development. I think that's something like that's my approach to this issue. But maybe like that approach is wrong. Maybe it's more like a certain player can meet if they work hard enough, they can meet a minimum baseline, but they can't meet like higher baselines. Like everyone can end up being a 33% the catch and shoot shooter, and not everyone can end up being 38%. So like maybe there's like thresholds within that. So I think that's really
right,
interesting.
exactly,
Yeah. So
yeah.
maybe like someone who's like from my approach at least, like someone who's been in the gym with all these people and like just experience all this and just someone just like a lot of experience in essence. I don't know.
I think most people on draft Twitter do consider upside more important, but not everybody by far.
No, I would say like I'm not that upset, but I think like if you have, it's more about your productivity. So if you have like incredible productivity and like you're young, I'm probably gonna be high. That's very, very simplistic, but like
Yeah.
players have like very incredible tools and like they're seen as they're cool archetype. Like I always say John Butler, he's like a prime example. Like they have very interesting archetypes that just like everything about them like screams NBA player like, from a very basic profile set. But when you actually deep into or dive into like productivity and like the various minutiae about like how like developed they are, it's like very raw. Like those type players I'm not as hot.
But I mean, you would agree, right, that you can't just
Oh,
do productivity and age.
oh yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, you can't like BPM or like even some better stat and
yeah, yeah,
age and just have
yeah,
yeah. So there's some indicators there of things that we're looking for. So what are we trying to get indicators of? And
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that's where I would say, yeah. So I'll
That's the
just go through it.
divergence.
What's it called? Even if you already know the stuff, I'll go through it real quick, just so you know, maybe
Yeah,
for some of the viewers and stuff, and
yeah.
just for our purpose. Like our aim would be to build a successful contending NBA team, correct? Like that
Okay,
would, like we're not trying to just settle for like an average team. We're not necessarily doing championship or nothing, but we want to be relatively successful.
okay.
So the best way to do that is by acquiring star players, because there's like a huge difference between star players and any other player. Because you know we any unless you like have like a radically different way of evaluating players in the
Mhm.
NBA level, or than the majority of people, you know, in the analysis scouting world. But I think like the general consensus pretty firmly stands that, you know, the difference between like the first and 10th player is like pretty equal to like the 10th and the 110th player. You know what I mean?
That's in it. Really?
Yeah, well, if you look at any of the commonly used statistics for evaluation, that called estimated plus minus. I think they did a survey of a bunch of scouts and GMs, and that was voted as like the best single own one stat. So yeah, if you look at the graph
Oh
on that
yeah,
stat,
see.
yeah,
Oh, that is actually makes, yeah, it's not very intuitive, I don't think. Like you don't immediately think that, but I guess for sure, like statistically it makes sense.
yeah. So because of that, like star players are by far the most valuable, and that's how you
Yeah.
build. Like if you look at, I mean, you look at historically, like majority of successful teams had like some of the best players. Usually, we talked about this with John actually, how, you know, having the top three players, or I said even like having just the best player in the single matchup gives you a huge advantage. And in the playoffs, that often comes to bear when, you know, teams who have the best single guy often, you know, even play above expectations.
Yeah.
So because everybody, you know, outside the stars, everybody is so close together, most NBA players kind of provide not a lot of value toward winning. You really need stars to make yourself stand out, because you know there's so many other good players. So the most important thing you could do in the draft is to get a star. Like that's by far like the most important thing that you want to do.
Makes sense, yeah. And you can acquire them for like obviously the salary implications of that too.
Yeah,
Like you have
and
them
of
a very
course,
cheap contract. Yeah,
yeah, because of the max contract also.
exactly.
Yeah, since there's a max and the stars are worth so much more than the max. I think I've said this before on the podcast, but the general rule is the two contracts you want to have are either a max contract or a minimum contract. Everything in between, usually guys are not quite worth the money they're getting paid. But the guys that are not, obviously not everybody, this is, you know, very broad, like
Yeah.
basic rule, but like in the general, like that's where you get the most value. Is either if you sign somebody who's really like a star and you sign them for the max, so they're worth a lot more, or you sign somebody who's just like a decent NBA player, but you're paying them the minimum.
Someone starts like farming the draft in a sense. Like once the players start reaching a certain age, to start like spamming trade them for like draft picks and just keep looking for like just shoot for upside every single like every 4 years. So you can keep consistently having like your top 2 or 3 players being on rookie contracts.
Yeah, but you can't really do that because of age, right? Because like guys only get so good when they're
No,
like
that
in their
is true. Yeah, the
prime.
age curve
Yeah,
is way worse. Yeah,
yeah, it's
that
hard.
is it. That's a good point.
Yeah, but to some extent, you should definitely be trading a lot more. Like you should, if you see a guy is not doing well, even like a pretty young guy after a year or two, it's pretty rare that they're gonna make like a huge jump to like superstar level. Even like somebody like Giannis who made like incredible developments, but pretty early on, it was obvious that there was a lot of talent there. So obviously, you wouldn't trade somebody like that. But in most cases, guys, if they're not really showing a ton, usually you should be giving up on them like sooner than teams tend to do nowadays, and just be more aggressive in trading them and trying to get new picks and yeah, taking risks. But the problem with doing that also is if you keep staying, like from a practical standpoint, if you keep staying at the bottom, you'll get fired.
Yeah, exactly. It's very
Yeah, yeah, that's like the best argument against the strategy is basically you get fired. But from a theoretical viewpoint, which is I think the way we're more looking at it,
yeah.
is I think it's very strong argument towards the strategy. So yeah, here just to show people that yeah, this is the estimated plus minus graph, and each dot is like a player. Like at the very top is Nikola Jokic last season, and number two, I forget who was number two last year, but maybe like Giannis maybe was, and
Yeah.
like then number three, I don't know, Steph, and then LeBron or Kawhi or whoever it was. And you see how like they're all so far apart. And I think number 10 was over here is Rudy Gobert. So from 1 to 10, and then is 9 - 5 is 4, and then 5 to 1 is 4, and that's Rudy Gobert to like I think I checked it was Nicholas Claxton who was 110th. So yeah, I mean, this is just last year, and obviously it varies year to year, but this is pretty generally, and not just for estimated plus minus, pretty much any one of these stats that you're looking for, that you look at that, obviously, again, these are not a perfect measure of value, but generally, I think most in the scouting front office, analysis community would agree that they're a pretty decent kind of stand-in for what we look at as true value. So yeah, so from because of this, yeah, that's why you basically want to look for stars as much as possible. In the especially at the top of the draft is where you could get them, but then as you go lower, you probably still want to swing for upside, just because
Yeah.
as you get to like 15, 20, a guy who's not hitting their upside is pretty much he's either like barely in the NBA or not even in the NBA at all. I think what's important to notice, the perception we have of what upside is, and I remember
Yeah.
John kind of touched on this where I kind of didn't agree with him, is he kind of mentioned that like athleticism is like a marker of upside, and I don't think that's as much true as is kind of, even to this day, continues to be kind of the prevalent thought process, is that these like mega athletic guys or these raw type of players are the ones that have upside, and then if you're more
Yeah.
polished early on, that kind of lowers your ceiling. I don't think that's necessarily true. So I think the problem isn't that you shouldn't be going for upside. I think people just don't understand what upside really is. And often players that people call high upside, especially like a lot of major media spots, are the ones that are actually pretty safe players and kind of low ceiling, high floor type of players. And then the
Yeah.
opposite, players that people call safe actually have, maybe some bad outcomes, but also have higher upside. And a lot of, I mean, not always, but
To like the best player available, like ideology is just beneficial, just because like every single tier you go down, like even at the top or the bottom, like just getting a player who's so much like commensurately better than everyone else, it's just like a wholly positive value proposition. So like you were saying, like when you're at the top, you're trying to get the stars, right? Like if you get the stars, that's like 80% of the way to a contender. And if you go down, when you go like to like the 50s or 15, like 30 range, like players in that range are usually not going to surmount to anything more than like high-end role players. Maybe you get like someone, obviously there's outliers, but like just in the general sense, just like
right.
consistently shooting for like the the best player. Maybe it's like not gonna, it's obviously not like 100% success rate, but I think out of any possible like approach, it probably has the highest like potential value.
Yeah, and not only that, what's it called? Missing on a star is like the worst thing you could do, is like, right? Because if you miss out on a star, that's like such a huge,
Oh yeah, yeah.
oh yeah, potential
Missing
difference
out
maker.
as in like you get some like you
Yeah,
go for someone and the next pick's like better than that or what?
yeah, like yeah, you could have had a star, but you don't hit on them. That I think that's like a huge mistake if you're a evaluator, is not taking a star. And on the other hand, if you swing for the fences and you mess up, it's really not a huge disadvantage if you think about it, because okay, so you'll suck again for another year and you'll get another high pick and another chance at a star. The NBA in the kind of weird way of kind of incentivizes you to, make these swings, because obviously, again, the practical argument is if you keep doing that, you'll get fired. But presuming the owner is with you on this and everything, and you're able, missing on a player, just gives you another good pick. Whereas if you take somebody who's maybe safer, and maybe they get your team to like a 40 win threshold, but not much higher than that, you're just stuck in the treadmill territory now.
Like a, it's again like I think everything we're talking about is very threshold oriented, but more so like this specifically, like there are very specific thresholds and where like you want to look for like a player who meets like certain types of criteria, like in terms of upside, but not like too low, obviously, or else you're gonna prevent your chances of even coming back the next year. So that is
Yeah.
a very duplicitous process.
Yeah. I think the one argument you made last time though was about guys that are kind of and I think where I got kind of confused, we're talking about like guys like a Trey Young or somebody, or like a Trey Burke, on a worse example is guys that kind of they're well, the way we talked about is a median versus mean, I think, but it's really a mode versus median, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah, that's true.
they have the most outcomes, and that's where I got confused. That's why I was like, wouldn't their mean and median be pretty close still? But
Yeah,
yeah, their mode would be a lot different, and that's where it could be a little bit different. But I feel like there's just not a ton of examples of those guys. It just happens rare enough where you wouldn't
exactly. Yeah. Very
really,
small
really,
sample size. Yeah,
yeah, of
like when you see someone very like kind of similar, then you just associate them with the success without actually considering the specific characteristics that make like that player who they are.
yeah, and you would still probably in a lot of those cases go for the upside,
Yeah,
because yeah, if
exactly.
you don't, like, that's one of the mistakes, well, me and Evan talked about this, how we both had Trey Young kind of somewhere. He was like a spot higher than me, I believe, but well, yeah, to me, I think that was a huge mistake on my part, whereas he felt like he did all right with that. So yeah, that's why I was so like low on myself, because like when you miss on a guy like that, I think that's like the worst thing that you could do. Wanted to bring this up about McCall,
Okay.
because just to my point, I think this is a decent way to kind of illustrate my point about McCall being able to raise his usage. So among players with at least 300 pull-up attempts last year, or even like at least 200, I think the lowest 2-point percentage I think was 31% by
2 point
RG.
percentage.
Yeah, on
Oh,
pull-ups
that's
was
true.
31% by RG Barrett. So if McCall just took 4 pull-ups a game, which would be 328 pull-ups in total for the season, and he shot them at 25%, which would be 6% lower than the lowest of any player in the NBA with that many attempts.
Yeah,
If he just did that, and then he also got an extra turnover a game, that alone would raise his usage up to 24. And his total true shooting and effective field goal percentage would still be similar to somebody like Julius Randle or Jaren Jackson and players like
that's actually interesting. Yeah. I didn't. I'm more surprised that RJ Barrett's that low. Is how many players qualified for this?
that. I think 60.
Really? Yeah. I guess that's the alternative way of thinking about the importance of just having someone who can take the number, those like requisite level pull-ups. But because RJ is theoretically, like I wasn't following the draft that heavily that year, but he is someone who I would have been pretty high on, right? He shoots pull-ups at a very like he can self-create in a sense, and he's 6'8", so that's a very productive archetype, but or
Well, the
reductive
thing
way of
is,
approaching it. But yeah,
sorry, but he's really young. Again, I think we
that's
mentioned
true.
this
Yeah,
last
again,
time,
yeah, there's a lot of
so
factors. He's
yeah,
a young player given a very high usage, and he's still
yeah.
just, like, struggling to find his like shooting.
Tough shot making, extremely difficult at a young age. Almost nobody really shoots at a high level
Yeah,
tough shots
exactly.
at a young age. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't. It's interesting. Also, Mikhail's kind of old, right? Because he played all 4 years.
Well, yeah, he's pretty much in his prime already. But my point is just simply that he could like technically raise his usage and still keep an effective field goal percentage, true shooting percentage in line with lower end NBA players. Whereas I don't think the point we made last time, if people don't remember, or you don't remember, is somebody with a high usage like that and the low true shooting can't just go down 15 usage and have like a extremely high true shooting. I'm sure they could go down usage, obviously that's easy, but to really reach those high true shooting efficiencies, I think is the
Oh, I
most
see what you mean.
difficult part of it.
Yeah, yeah. It kind of depends on the peripherals too, right? Like, I think if you scale it, like for example, Jordan Poole, he's someone I watched this morning, and then just like he's shooting like 34% from three and like 90 leads the league in free throw percentage, and his shot selection is pretty horrendous. So if you did manage to like scale him down to like a very strict like off the catch shooting rule, his numbers would go up, right? Like it's very basic, but if he just took better shots, he would shoot better three-point percentages. If you diminished his on-ball responsibilities and made him take more spot ups, when you have players with very good peripherals, and obviously he's very young, he's still growing in the on-ball pains. But if you scale their usage back and they already have very good shooting peripherals, for example, like I'm just taking shooting for example, like if they're shooting 90% from the line, and you scale them to low spot up roll, I think he would reach like Mikhail level shooting numbers. So just, I don't know, like if you have players who have the ability to play on ball and you're kind of diminishing them into an off ball role while they do have very good shooting peripherals or whatever the peripherals may be, I'd still take the guy who has like the high on ball equity rather than someone who can't go from off ball to on ball.
I mean, it depends on the player. Like, obviously, you would take the really effective, high usage guys, like, who are
Yeah, that's true.
efficient with high
Yeah,
usage.
I don't think Poole is very efficient though. Like I love Poole, but I don't think he's a
Well,
great
yeah.
on ball creator right
So,
now.
yeah, absolutely. So, about somebody like Poole, what I found to be the case in cases like that is it doesn't really work like that. Definitely, guys, to some degree, if they lower the usage, they cut out some of the bad shots, but more broadly, their shot diet generally stays similar. Like, you can't just only cut the bad shots. Like, it doesn't really work like that most times. Like, Jordan Poole had a lower usage at other levels. Like in high school, I think he was like a seventh man or something because he played for a local high school team, and he
Oh,
still
really?
took a
Yeah.
ton of like horrible shots. And early on in his Michigan career, I might be misremembering this, but we could look it up. I think he had like a 17 usage or something like that as a freshman, if I recall correctly. And there was still a lot of really difficult shots in there. Granted, definitely not as much as he is, whatever he is right now in Golden State, but I think it does to some degree. Shot selection does improve, but generally, I would think it doesn't. You can't just cut away and make them strictly take open spot ups. That usually doesn't work like that. Guys are the way they
Yeah, that's
are,
true.
kind of for a
That's very
reason.
idealistic. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that wasn't a commentary on what I would do with them. I'm just saying like
Well,
when you
yeah,
have
yeah, I'm
play,
saying, but
yeah,
if you try, even if you try to do that, like you can't really do that for most players. Most
yeah.
players, the way their shot diet is their shot diet because of who they are and how they approach the
No,
game and
yeah,
stuff.
that's
Like
true.
it's
That's
not
true.
that easy. Like
Yeah,
to some extent, it is true. Like we see often with particular the role of like small ball five. When you take a
yeah,
guy who plays wing, and we often see with like a Kumingo or Precious Achuva, that's like the one spot where that's been decently like effective and like viable, like taking guys that are like these bigger wings and maybe don't have the quite the perimeter skill and shooting touch to really play that role, and then using them as more like small ball fives to take advantage of their athletic ability and physical tools and stuff like that. They're able to become pretty significantly more efficient with less usage, but in other roles it hasn't proven to be as effective to be able to do that.
yeah. I just think like you did say like the shot diet is somewhat a product of all of their experiences and how it reflects how they approach the game in a sense. But I think, for example, like Mikhail Bridges, his shot diet is so basic because he doesn't have the on-ball skills to even expand the shot diet. So shot diet is like it's kind of a function of scalability in a sense. So when
But
you
can
do,
he take four pull-ups from long twos, like the most easily defended shot, like the shot people want to give up pretty much, And by the way, he shoots 50% on long twos and over 200 attempts already off the dribble.
Are those pull-ups though?
Yeah, yeah, off the dribble, but they're like one dribble pull-ups. But still,
Yeah.
he obviously has touch. Like he's not a non-shooter by any means. So just taking even like difficult long twos, just forcing four of them a game, I think he could shoot 25%, right? RJ Barrett is the worst with 31%, so he'd be considerably worse than that. But still, like just doing that and then having a
Yeah.
turnover just from the extra amount of times he would have the ball, he would say he would average also one turnover more per game. That alone gets him to like a 24, I think, usage. And his effective field goal percentage and true shooting percentage would be pretty similar to like a Julius Randle, Jaren Jackson, a little bit better, I think, even than like RJ, but lower usage than RJ. RJ, I think it's like up to 27 usage or something like that. But yeah, just from doing,
Yeah.
but that's like a very like you're giving them like the worst, easiest to get shot possible and putting it in extremely low efficiency.
Yeah. I don't know if he'd actually be able to incorporate that like within like the scheme of the coach, right? When you're actually drawing out plays.
Well, yeah,
you have-
nobody would want to do that because that's just
Exactly.
why do you want them to take four super low? But if you forced it, you could technically do it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. I'm trying to think like how you can actually logically apply that, like how a coach would actually incorporate that.
We have the value projection chart. I think that's pretty basic. We don't have to stick to that by any means, but I think just from right now
Yeah,
where
it's a
we're
good
at with
framework.
it,
Yeah.
yeah, just it's so obvious and basic, so we might as well stick with it. So then yeah, later if we decide that it doesn't make sense, we could definitely move away from it. I'm not by no means saying that this is what we need to be doing, but yeah, I think we'd start looking at kind of how do you say it, categorizing players, like categorization. And I don't know if you read the article I put out on Patreon with the
I
we're
think
talking about
yeah.
with archetypes. So kind of like that the archetype tree, that ugly horrible diagram I drew. What's it called? Just
Yeah.
thinking about, do we want to divide players into 5 archetypes? I mean, that's the most intuitive because there's 5 positions, 5 players on the floor at any one given moment. Maybe we could do that and then divide each one of those into subcategories of its on itself and kind of moving down the tree and then figuring out for each archetype what is the best approach to figuring it out. But and then obviously also how do we decide where those lines are. We don't necessarily want to just stick to stats because there's obvious limitations with that. So yeah, just I think figuring those things out and then bringing different people on to speak about each different archetype that we figure out or figure out with them where we draw these archetypes, I think is probably what I would gravitate towards next.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I kind of talked about it on one of the episodes, but P3 Sports Science.
Yes.
Yeah, they do their own clustering of like different archetypes, but it's all solely based on biomechanical data where they just like calculate the entire profile of each player and they just run that in like some sort of cluster analysis, and they have their own archetypes. And the interesting thing about the way they portray the archetypes is that obviously the archetypes are their own like discrete entities, but there is a lot of overlap. Like they draw it like as a like you think of Venn diagrams, it's just like 8 different circles and they're all overlapping a little bit. So like players can have a sort of like 2 different archetypes, right? Or they can be in like the middle or something, and they can be in 3 archetypes, or they can be on the very edge and just be like in a certain like an edge case archetype. Or I think that's a very interesting way of like portraying archetypes, not as their own different entities, but as like a free flowing like some archetypes flow into each other and just overlap. So like a multi
Absolutely.
Venn
Yeah.
diagram ish. That'd be kind of
Yeah,
cool.
we'll never have like true like hard lines between them. You're right
Exactly.
about
Yeah.
that. But we still want to get as close as possible and figure out the best ways to, have those distinctions.
Yeah. But like I know some people are very adamant about when they talk about archetypes, they're like, oh, this player is a 4 at the next level. He cannot play the 5, or like
No,
it's
that's
very like
terrible. Yeah.
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 And I really want to avoid that.
But
I don't want like arguments about archetype. I think you can be multiple archetypes. That's just inherent.
And yeah, I think it's important to also distinguish their current archetype against descriptive, prescriptive, value projection. What are they
Yeah,
right
yeah, that's
now,
true.
as opposed to what are we projecting them to? And I
Yeah.
think you have to be really careful in projection. I'm very anti this. Is I always call missing forest for trees. Is, oh, this guy projects into this role, so he's going to be good or he's going to be not good. Whereas guys develop in so many unpredictable ways, you never want to box a guy in into a certain role when you're projecting. I think that's a very poor way of
Yeah, yeah.
approaching
No,
it.
that's exactly what I was trying to say. Like, because there's so much of draft Twitter that just projects immediate strengths, and then when a player like exceeds those immediate strengths, they're like, oh, outlier development, we can't really predict that. But I just feel like you can predict so much of this outlier development, and part of that is the pigeonholing of archetypes, where you say this guy's a 4 right now, he's gonna be a 4 later. He can't do this. Like, I just don't think he can do it. That's just not a good way of thinking. If there's no real logic within what you're saying, if you're just simply saying they can't play it because they can't do it right now, I think that's a very fundamental flaw, right? So I think that when we do portray like these archetypes, I think we not only do we have to show it as malleable, but I think there has to be some sort of discussion about outlier development where we can say these are like the various traits of these players that tend to like these are the traits of players who were 4s or like they're like 6'8" and they're very athletic and they ended up being 5s. Like, what are the traits of Precious and Kaminga that allowed them to play the 5? And maybe a sort of list of potential 5s. So maybe projecting the potential archetypes rather than simply saying this is what their archetype's going to be. So any discussion of archetypes within a college to NBA like landscape has to incorporate some sort of analysis of the key factors that lead to divergences and the immediate projections of those archetypes to begin with. So just simply put, just we need to talk about outlier development and the inherent causes of outlier development before we can effectively like um, spread the archetypes around and just immediately project the archetypes. And
Yeah,
that was kind of
absolutely.
long-winded, but yeah.
No, that was a very good point. Also, I'll say I think there's a kind of a lack of practicality in a lot of these
Yeah.
predictions. Like, I was guilty of this too, especially when I first started doing this. Is nobody's ever a small forward. There's nobody who ever is going to play the three according to projections. Because if you're, if you can't decide if you're a three or a four, you're always better as a four. And if you're, not big enough to play the three, then you should probably just be a two. So when we're doing projections, we always say, "Oh, this guy is probably just going to end up being a four, a playmaking four, or a stretch four, small ball four." But in reality, you can't you can't skip a position. You can't play four players. You need somebody in that three spot. So
Yeah.
the guy I always think of this as OG Ananobi is a guy who everybody said that he's going to be a four at the next level, and I think that's probably still his best position, like technically, but because there's a kind of a dearth, like a lack of these of people that could really play that small forward position to have the requisite physical tools and size for it and the skill. He's played a lot of three throughout his career. I'm not sure in the last couple of seasons I haven't watched him as much, but definitely in this first several seasons that was his most used position by a decent margin. So yeah, I think that like that's an example of where people kind of look at, yeah, sure, for him individually he's best at the four, but because the NBA needs three so bad, he probably projects more as a three.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of unhinged, but like our name's a little unhinged scouting note. But I think that like positions are like the way we divide positions is I think it lacks a lot of nuance, right? Like I don't think there's that much of a difference between a 3 and a 4. Like maybe I think that sounds like kind of hot to begin with, right? But I think that all these positions are kind of like coalescing into like one like just one kind of type of player who can just if you can fundamentally dribble, pass, and shoot, you can play a number of positions. And I just don't think
Absolutely.
that immediately projecting a player into like one of these 5 roles, like obviously there is a difference between like a 6 foot point guard and like a 6'10" center, right? Like there is a difference. You can't really overlay one to the other position, another into one. But I think that there is a lot more like malleability within like the 3 and 4, for example, or like the 2 and 3. I think you can pretty easily flow from one to the other. So I think that if that even is possible, like if there is like an avenue for one type of player to become another type of player, we need to really evaluate a paradigm to begin with, right? Like if we can have a 3 who can play the 2 or the 4, and they can start guarding. Like if there's a five, you can start guarding twos and threes, right? Like if there's so much like different like intersections, like at a point, are these intersections even valuable? Are these like should we deviate them and delineate these archetypes if they're just going to end up like flowing into each other? And is there like a better way of like actually approaching this? And I think there probably is a better way of evaluating like position versatility rather than simply like allotting them to like two or three, just because that's what they are doing in college, or even that's what we project them to do. But just in a sense, I think that there, especially nowadays, you can flow so well into different types of positions. Like you can go from 2 to 3 to 4, or 4 to 2, or not, it's 4 to 3. Like there's so much like intersections within all of those that there's probably a better way of archetypes rather than simply the 1 through 5 commonality that we've been seeing a lot. But I don't really know exactly how to do it. I just like I can diagnose the problem, but I can't really like form like an analysis of what exactly we should do. I don't have an actual solution. I just think that what we're doing right now is inefficient, and we should probably think of some better ways to actually approach this archetyping.
Yeah, but it is important to know, guys. Like we don't have to call it 1 through 5 or point guard, small forward, whatever. But there is going to be always 5 players on the court. Like I mean, technically you can have 4 if everybody fouls out, but that's like never. I
Yeah,
don't think that's ever happened in history. And obviously you can't play 6 players. So yeah, you're always going to have 5 players. There's always going to be the tallest player, the second tallest, the third tallest, the fourth tallest, and the fifth tallest.
yeah. Like if you run through two small forwards right in a game,
Yeah, you could technically, but
yeah,
one of them
like
is going to be the third tallest on the
exactly right.
lineup. So he's the
Like
small
yeah,
forward, basically. Like you don't have to call it, but that's basically what it is, correct?
yeah. I think like the 1 through 5 designations is also very like physical based, right? Like the 1 is going to be shorter than the 4, right? The 5 is
Right.
going to be the tallest player on the court. So I think we start to conflate the actual 1 through 5 with just like physicality or like height thresholds. And when
Yeah.
you when you have players who are like 6'8" and they can pass the ball and they can also shoot, like what is LeBron in a sense? That's a very extreme example, right? But when you have these players that have such holistic skill sets, you can't pigeonhole into like a certain archetype. You can't pigeonhole them into like 2 or 3. They can be 4, they can be 1. They can like if you have, I think when we start to forget that these 1 through 5 is more indication of skill rather than actual like height or physicality, then you can start utilizing these positions correctly. But when you start conflating them with height, when you start conflating them with like the more physical rather than the intrinsic skill aspects of the player's game, then you start running into these types of problems where you start projecting players into roles rather than actually like evaluating what their actual skill set is and how well they can fit into these other roles that you don't immediately project them into simply because they don't meet those mental thresholds of height and physicality. And that
Yeah,
makes sense.
and also like archetype, what does that mean? It's just like basically saying like a fancy way of saying a type of player. So we could
Exactly.
even apply like value judgments to it, where we could say this archetype are just players that are really good, like LeBron, or we could like make more delineations, like a player who's taller than 6'4" and has excellent passing skills and high ability to get to the rim or whatever, and then that would be like LeBron, Luka Doncic, and Giannis or whatever. I'm just
Yeah.
spitballing, but just to give an example, like there's like many ways to delineate, like yeah, like separate them and distinguish them. So yeah, it's not only like based on physical tools per se, even though that's commonly how we think about is mainly through their physical characteristics. But yeah, we could also add skill based and kind of
Yeah.
value based characteristics as well if we find that to be functional.
Yeah, I think we were talking about archetypes before in like the first episode, and we brought up the concept of like threshold weighted archetypes, where a player can they can probably, especially in projection, you can say, oh, this player can end up doing all of these things. The NBA point guard is the duties of an NBA point guard, right? But if they don't meet those actual minimum threshold, they can pass. They have a 30% assist rate, but they can't get to the rim. Like they can't create those openings where you can drive to the rim and kick out. If you can't get to the rim in the first place, you can't really be an NBA point guard, right? So it's like it's all these like literally a minutiae where you have like these thresholds and you evaluate whether the player can meet these thresholds rather than simply saying this player plays a 1 on their team. Like for example, Lonzo Ball played point guard on his team and he's 31% assist rate and he runs the floor in transition. Like he looks like a point guard. But if you actually look at the role of an NBA point guard and you overlay that with what he was doing at UCLA, like you start to see like the deficiencies in their game and the deficiencies in the actual projection, rather than simply he plays one here, he's gonna play one here. So I think if we do evaluate archetypes in the NBA or even in projection, we need to have like some sort of like thresholds that each player needs to meet. And maybe they can be statistically, maybe we can just create a list of like things that each archetype actually has to do. And then we can juxtapose that into every single prospect and see, can they meet this? Can they not meet this? And then the actual nuance in that, this is the hard part, is like certain players don't meet every single like bullet point, right? Like they'll meet like 8 of the 10 criterion. So you have to like weight you have to weight the bullet points in a way where you can like point out the most immediate obvious parts, and then out of the bullet points they don't meet, you can look into the past and say, all right, like Trae Young is 6 foot, like he's barely 6'1", and he's not physical at all. Like he's a very large defensive inefficiency when you put him on the court. So like how do you overcome that? What are examples of players who have overcome these deficiencies? So I think there's so much nuance in it that I think the best approach to this is forming like a bunch of thresholds and then weighting those thresholds and then seeing what are examples of players who don't meet every threshold but still manage to provide positive expected value. There's so much nuance in it, but yeah.
I think the way I would look at it is start with the like non-shooters, because there's just not a lot of non-shooters in the NBA. So right away we could eliminate most non-shooters except for, and that's when we'll decide, except for, I don't know, like who's like a really good non-shooter, maybe like somebody like Bam.
Or Bam, yeah, oh good,
yeah, like somebody like Bam, like, oh, they're an incredible athlete, they have certain mobility traits and flashes of feel or whatever. Those players, even as non-shooters, they have a shot, so we could keep those guys. But otherwise, non-shooter guys that are don't have a lot of shooting upside for the most part are going to be kind of quote unquote eliminated from our.
No, that's
and then
true.
and then we go to the next thing, whatever that may be, maybe athleticism. Guys that are can't even dunk, have 0 career dunks in the NCAA. There's the Trae Youngs. There's somebody who's mega skilled and smart. But outside of those guys, we could get rid of, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's actually, and making archetypes based off that might be like the move, honestly. Like,
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
unathletic, like you could, I guess that's like everyone's athletic in their own right, obviously in the NBA, but like people who have low dunk totals and can't shoot, and like you just make an archetype based off that. Obviously it's going to be a very, very small population, if any, but just slowly like you have to segment the population into a variety of different like athleticism. Even athleticism is way too broad, like specifically like 0 dunks, like that's rim pressure, right? So like the number of like self-created dunks overlaid with the amount of like advantage they're creating as a passer, right? Like just like creating all these different like categories that may not make intuitive sense together, but just overlaying so many different.
As far as like people not understanding models, that's just like, what can you say? That's just, they're bad. Like, what are you like? It's like saying, oh, there's a lot of people that don't really know like how to scout pick and roll or like understand how to evaluate player athleticism. Well, then you shouldn't be a scout. You don't know, you don't have a complete understanding. Like, learn it. If you want to be a good player evaluator, you have to learn everything as much as you can about it. And that's a huge important component of it, and you don't understand, then you probably shouldn't be a scout, or at least maybe you're an amazing eye tester and you're just not good with numbers. Well, then collaborate with somebody who is good and do work with, in tandem.
But I think there's like an art, right, in analytics in a sense, where we all have like the analytics I'm thinking of is more Bartorvik synergy based, where I don't know if that's like the analytics you're thinking of, but simply having like an entire spreadsheet of numbers where you have access to all the different like minutiae of like statistics for so many different types of indicators, so many different types of things that are measured on the court in essence. And you have all these numbers, but the whole part of the analytics test in a sense is how you actually incorporate those numbers into your process. So when you are when you are really well-versed in eye test, right, it's very easy to like formulate your own process along the way, because you're not like throwing all these you're not, when you're looking at the eye test, you dictate every single aspect of it. You dictate what you value, you dictate what you don't value, and you like specifically look at the game through your lens, and maybe there's positives to that, there's negatives to that. But the eye test is very controllable by you. But when you do like the analytics, you're just throwing a bunch of numbers and you don't necessarily know how exactly to incorporate those numbers into your process. And that can be a little bit overwhelming. And then you have these models, which like they do the incorporation of the numbers for you, and you don't even know how to trust that. So I do actually, I sympathize a little bit with the, like people who haven't like looked at analytics very, very deeply, because you have to form your own process off the model, off the numbers, and you have to go retrospectively and look at previous years and see which numbers are more indicative of future success. What are the underlying numbers for each of these different types of skills? So I think a lot of the analytics is just like, for me personally, I just scroll through Bartorvik for hours. Like that's just how I approached it. And I just saw like certain things that popped out for like different types of archetypes or different types of players who over exceed or under exceed expectations. So there's a lot of trial and error that isn't necessarily, there is obviously trial and error in every single thing you do, but more so for analytics. It's a very tangible trial and error where you can specifically see what traits are positive, what traits are negative. And if you miss on a player, you can really look at their statistical profile and hone in on what you missed and what you didn't miss. So the aspect of trial and error where you're taking all these numbers and just formulating your own weights and orienting them in a sense to form your eye test or your analytics versus eye test formulations. I think that's probably it's a big barrier, but if you are able to actually effectively coalesce them, that is obviously that's the goal.
Right. Well, I mean, again, to be if it takes a certain skill to be good at something, you can't be good at that unless you have that skill. It's like me saying like, "Oh, it's
Yeah.
really hard to dunk. Why can't I be a pro player?" You know, like,
Yeah.
well, you have to be a better athlete. I'm sorry, that's the way it works. You know, like, I think, and yeah, again, like you don't. Maybe there's definitely people out there that are great eye testers and maybe are not good with math, and that's fine. But then they have to be open to input from people that are
Yeah.
good at math, in my opinion, or the opposite. Also, people that are not good with models. But see, in my experience, I've never heard. Yeah, I can't think of maybe Dean a little bit kind of walked
Yeah.
that line at times, but very few people out there that will say no, eye test is useless. Just listen to the stats. You know, most analytics people are pretty open to input from eye
Yeah.
test, whereas the other way around, it's not always as much.
No, that's true.
And but as far as like the black box stuff, and it's definitely again, not every model is good. Not all stats are useful. It's definitely you have to learn which ones. That's definitely a good point. There's a lot of stats that are not useful, or even a lot of stats that are useful, but you have to know how to apply them
Exactly.
in what
Yeah.
way. Yeah, I 100% agree with that, and it's just the same with eye test. You know, you may see certain skills that to novice may seem like a very useful skill, but as you learn more through watching more film and you know understanding more, you kind of appreciate that less and maybe appreciate another part of the game more. Like when I started watching before I really started taking this seriously, for example, I had very low understanding of the defensive end of the floor. I basically evaluated players on like 80-90% just on the offensive end. You know, and then as eventually as I understood more, I understood how important the defense. In fact, at one point, I probably overvalued defense even to some extent. But now, hopefully, I'm doing better with that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's the same on both ends. And yeah, as far as just the models and the fact that we don't have them, and maybe the fact that even the ones if we do have them, they're not always super clear with the process again, like the black box thing. I think just studying them and looking back at the results we do have from Lane back in the day, Jake's old model is still out there. Seeing some of again the trends, general patterns, and kind of approaches and stuff like that that you could take from the players that commonly do well in those or players that commonly do poorly with those. I think just applying those lessons that you take from like those really high level models, and then obviously bringing in your eye test and really blending those two approaches together, in my
Yeah.
opinion,
Yeah.
without the actual ability to make a model as good as Jake's, I think is pretty much the best way to get results in the draft.
Yeah, I
Uh,
just don't know which models to even look at right now because there's not that many out there. And out of the ones that are out there, I can't really think of any off the top of my head that have data like the data available for how they fared in previous years. So like if you can't see how they fared, it's hard to evaluate the true veracity of the model. But like theoretically, like if there was like I did use Jake's models a little bit in my evaluation. And I found it very helpful. Just where's the next Jake, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, but again, we just taking the lessons we learned from Jake
Yeah.
and Wayne, I think that already brings us like we could kind of simulate maybe 90% of what their model brings if we have a good understanding of the kind of the general trends and patterns and stuff like that that those
Yeah.
models use to rank players. And I think Jake and Dwayne, this is not a diss to them, they would agree that because is the more like detailed you get and the more you kind of make minor changes and kind of stuff like that, you start to get diminishing returns, obviously. So yeah, like pretty much like the main part of it we could kind of gather from just studying the models ourselves. And obviously you need to have certain affinity for numbers and stats, but again, if you don't have that, then find work with somebody who does, in my opinion, or at least if you want to get the best possible results for projecting players in the draft.